The knock on my door wasn't gentle, it came like a hammer splitting wood. "Darling, your mom locked the account, I can't transfer money from her card anymore," Amber's voice shrieked from the phone on the counter. I froze halfway through folding the clean towels, my fingers tightening around the fabric. Her tone carried that sharp edge I'd come to recognize, panic mixed with entitlement. 30 minutes later, tires screeched on the gravel outside. I didn't need to look through the window to know it was my son. The engine cut the car door, slammed, and then came the pounding. "Mom, open up, what did you do?" The sound vibrated through the frame. I wiped my hands on my apron, took a breath, and walked to the living room. At 68, I'd faced hurricanes, hospital shifts that lasted 30 hours, and the death of my husband, but nothing prepared me for the fury of my own child. Behind that door was the boy I'd raised alone, the one who used to bring me wildflowers after school. Now his voice carried the same rage his father once had during his worst drinking nights. "Mom," the pounding grew louder. I opened the door and there he was, David, 40 years old, in his work shirt, sleeves rolled up, sweat glistening on his temple. His eyes, once soft green like spring, were now sharp with accusation. "You changed the password on your card," he said, voice trembling with anger. Amber was at the store. Her payment got declined. Everyone stared at her. She called me crying. "You humiliated her." I steadied my voice. "David, lower your tone. We're not at work and I'm not one of your employees. Why would you do that to her?" His words came like bullets. "We're family, she was buying groceries for the house. You made her look like a thief." "Groceries?" I asked quietly. "Tell me, does your grocery list include jewelry and spa treatments?" He blinked, momentarily thrown off, then stepped closer. "You're twisting this. You've always been generous. What's gotten into you lately?" I could feel the familiar tremor in my chest, the one that came every time I tried to stay calm while being scolded by my own child. "What's gotten into me," I said slowly, "is the realization that boundaries are not betrayals." David's jaw clenched. "So now you're punishing us for needing help?" "I'm not punishing anyone. I'm protecting what's mine." He let out a harsh laugh. "Yours, Mom, everything you have you built for this family. You can't just decide to lock us out." "I didn't lock us out," I said. "I locked you two out. There's a difference." He stepped back as if struck. For a second I saw the little boy again, the one who used to run to me after a nightmare. But the look vanished, replaced by cold resentment. Amber's name flashed on his phone. He lifted it, his tone softening instantly. "Yeah, babe, I'm here. She's being unreasonable. Don't worry, I'll handle it." He ended the call and looked at me. "You see what you're doing, you're driving a wedge between us." "I'm not the one who turned money into love's condition," I replied. He stared at me speechless. The ticking of the old wall clock filled the silence. Outside, cicadas hummed in the Georgia heat. Finally, he said, "You're getting paranoid, Mom. Amber's been nothing but kind to you. Maybe it's time someone else helped you manage your accounts before you start forgetting things." That cut deeper than he could imagine. "You think I'm losing my mind because I don't want my money used without permission. I think you're acting irrational. I think you're acting entitled." His face flushed red. For a moment I thought he'd shout, but he just shook his head, muttering, "Unbelievable." I walked past him to the kitchen, needing space. "Would you like some water?" I asked, the calm in my voice surprising even me. He followed, still fuming. "Mom, listen to yourself," Amber cried. "In public because of you. She cried because she got caught," I said softly. "There's a difference between shame and remorse." He slammed his palm on the counter. "We're not thieves, then stop acting like ones." The words hung between us like a loaded gun. He stared at me for a long second, then grabbed his keys. "You'll regret this," he said. "When you see how it destroys our relationship, you'll regret it." "Boundaries don't destroy relationships," I said, meeting his glare. "They reveal them." He turned, stormed out, and the front door banged shut so hard the window panes rattled. Silence. The kind that presses on your chest until you can barely breathe. I sat down in my armchair, the same one where I'd once cradled him as a baby when he had nightmares. My hands trembled, but I didn't cry. I just stared at the framed photo on the mantel, me, Robert, and David at his college graduation, All smiles, the world still intact. The clock ticked louder. In the distance, his car roared down the street, tires squealing as he took the corner too fast. For a long while I didn't move. My house felt heavier, as if the air itself had changed density. I whispered to the empty room, "You raised a good man once, Loretta. Maybe he's still in there somewhere." I rose, walked to the window, and looked out at the garden. The begonias drooped under the afternoon sun, thirsty and neglected. I fetched the watering can, then stopped halfway to the porch. My knees ached, but I stood tall. For years I'd watered everything around me, plants, people, problems, trying to keep them alive. But some things die no matter how much you tend to them. I placed the watering can back on the shelf. The phone buzzed again. Amber's name flashed on the screen. I let it ring until it went silent. The machine picked up her voice, shrill and cutting. "Loretta, I hope you're happy. You embarrassed us. You're acting like we're strangers. Don't expect us to come by until you fix this." The line clicked. I stared at the phone, then whispered, "Good." The sun dipped lower, painting the walls gold. I sat back in my chair, folded my hands, and exhaled. My pulse slowed, my thoughts sharpened. For the first time in months, my mind felt clear. They thought I'd only changed the password. But as I looked toward the study where the safe sat behind a framed painting, I knew the truth. I hadn't just changed the password. I'd changed the will. The next morning, sunlight poured through the kitchen curtains, turning the old ceramic tiles golden. I sat at the table with my coffee, watching steam curl upward like smoke from a slow-burning fire. The garden outside looked peaceful, every petal glistening with dew, but my mind refused that calm. Before the shouting, before the slammed door, there had been laughter. I used to think generosity could hold a family together. That was before I learned how quickly kindness could turn into a weapon. 5 years ago, everything had seemed simpler. David had just gotten engaged to Amber. He came to visit that weekend with a smile I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. "Mom," he'd said, his eyes bright, "I want you to meet someone special." Amber had walked into my living room in a cream blouse and pearls, shaking my hand with the precision of someone who had practiced sincerity in a mirror. "It's such an honor, Mrs. Green. David talks about you all the time." Back then, I'd wanted so much to believe her. She had the kind of beauty that photographs well, clean lines, calculated softness. When she laughed, she leaned forward just enough to make you feel like she was sharing a secret. During dinner, she told me how she'd grown up with nothing, how she admired women who could stand on their own. "You remind me of my grandmother," she said, touching my wrist lightly. "Strong, calm, always taking care of everyone." I'd smiled at that, the compliment wrapping itself around the ache of widowhood like a bandage. For years since Robert's death, I had filled the silence of this house with the sound of other people's needs. Maybe that's why Amber's praise had felt like sunlight. When they announced their wedding, I didn't hesitate. I offered to pay for half of it. David protested at first, he always did, but I could see the relief in his eyes when I insisted. "It's my gift," I said. "You only get married once." Looking back, that was the first time I ignored the small voice that whispered, "Be careful." The ceremony was small, elegant, every detail curated by Amber. I signed checks for the venue, the florist, the band. On the day itself, I stood beside David in the photos, proud and foolishly certain that my family had grown, not shifted. For a while, everything was perfect. Sunday dinners, shared laughter, Amber arriving with homemade desserts and long hugs. "You're my second mom," she'd say. "I don't know what I'd do without you." The first favor was small. "Loretta, could we borrow a few hundred?" she'd asked one afternoon over coffee. "Our rent's due before David's paycheck. $200. It felt harmless. I wrote the check, she kissed my cheek, and that was that. Then another month came. "We're short again. You know how expensive everything's gotten." 300. Then 5. It became a rhythm, one I told myself was temporary. I was proud I could help them. After all, hadn't I worked decades as a nurse so my family wouldn't struggle? By the 6th month, the total had crept near 5,000. I brought it up one evening when they came for dinner. "David, I think we should make a plan to settle the loan soon," I said, trying to sound gentle. He looked uncomfortable, slicing his meat slower than usual. Mom, you know we'll pay you back. Why are you keeping such exact accounts? Before I could answer, Amber spoke, her voice like honey poured over a blade. You're right, Loretta. We've been careless. Tell you what, we'll give you my credit card as a guarantee until we return it all. I didn't want her card, but her tone made me feel childish for refusing. So I nodded. All right. A week later, she called, voice trembling. Mrs. Green, I have an emergency. My card's blocked and my mother's sick. Can I borrow yours just for the medicine? I hesitated, but said yes. After all, it was just medicine. That night, curiosity nudged me to check my online statement. Pharmacy, $120. Then $200 at a clothing store. $300 at a restaurant. I confronted her the next day. She clasped her hands, eyes glistening. I'm so sorry. I saw a sale and I thought, well, I thought you wouldn't mind. I'll pay it back right away. She didn't. But every time I tried to remind her, she'd find a new emergency car repair, anniversary dinner, a friend's wedding gift. Each one came wrapped in guilt and tears. Don't you trust me? She'd whisper. We're family. I began to wonder when that word had turned into a cage. David didn't help. When I told him, he sighed like a weary teacher. Mom, please don't make things awkward. Amber's trying her best. She's spending more than I make in a month, I said. Stop worrying so much. You've got plenty saved. It's not like you need all of it. That one sentence built a wall between us. I remember sitting in my armchair that night. The house quiet, except for the ticking clock. My ledger lay open on my lap, every transaction underlined in red ink. The numbers blurred through tears. Robert had always said, generosity is beautiful, but it needs fences. I'd laughed at the time. Now I understood. The next morning, Amber came by with a basket of muffins. I made your favorite blueberry. Her timing was perfect. She always arrived right after a storm. I let her in, too tired to fight. Mrs. Green, she began sweetly, I wanted to apologize again for all the confusion. I hate that money is coming between us. I looked at her, at the expensive manicure, the diamond earrings. It's not money that's between us, Amber. It's honesty. She blinked, then smiled as if she hadn't heard. You're so strong, you know. I hope when I'm your age I'll be just like you, so trusting, so kind. Trusting. The word hit me like a warning bell. When she left, she hugged me tighter than usual. I felt her hand brush near my handbag, quick as a whisper. That night my card went missing. I found it 2 days later, slipped back into my wallet. No note, no explanation. The statement at the end of the month showed another $500 spent on clothes and cosmetics. I didn't say a word. Because that's what love had turned me into, a quiet witness to my own exploitation. On Sunday, when they came for dinner, everything looked normal again. Amber complimented my cooking, David laughed at old stories. I smiled on cue, pretending the knot in my chest wasn't tightening. After they left, I stood at the sink washing dishes one by one, my reflection wavering in the window pane. The night outside was still, the streetlight soft. Somewhere a dog barked and the sound made me flinch. That was the first time I truly felt fear inside my own home. Not of thieves breaking in, but of family already inside. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands slowly. My heart thudded in the silence. Upstairs in the bedroom, I took out the old photo album, pictures of birthdays, graduations, smiles that once seemed permanent. I traced David's face with my thumb. I taught you to be kind, I whispered. I never meant for you to learn to take. I closed the album, slid it back into the drawer, and sat on the edge of the bed. The air felt heavy, like the moment before a summer storm. Downstairs, the answering machine blinked red, one new message. Amber's voice filled the room. Hi, Mom. Just wanted to let you know I'm picking up a few things for dinner tomorrow. Hope that's okay. I'm using your card, don't worry, I'll return it. I pressed delete before she finished. The machine beeped once the light went dark, and I sat there in the quiet, knowing something inside me had just shifted. That was the first night I decided I wouldn't let them spend another dollar of my life without my say. Sunday morning came wrapped in soft sunlight and the smell of blooming jasmine outside my porch. I was sweeping the kitchen floor when a knock sounded, 3 polite taps that almost sang. I opened the door to find Amber smiling, a bouquet of yellow roses in her arms, and a basket of warm muffins balanced on one hip. "Good morning, Mrs. Green," she chimed. "I thought I'd surprise you. You work too hard." The sweetness in her tone would have melted butter. I stepped aside, letting her in, though my stomach had already begun to tighten. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said, taking the flowers. "You didn't have to." "Oh, but I wanted to," she replied, setting the basket on the counter. "You've been so generous to us, and I feel like I don't say thank you enough." I smiled faintly, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. Amber looked around the kitchen, nodding at the tidy counters, the clean windows. "You keep everything so perfect," she said. "David says you've always been organized. Maybe you could teach me how to manage things like that." I poured us both tea, watching her face in the reflection of the kettle. "You're already managing plenty," I said. Amber giggled softly. "If only." Between work and the bills and David's long hours, sometimes I forget where I even put my receipts. She sighed dramatically. "You're lucky to have a mind that sharp at your age. Honestly, I don't know how you do it." Her words were sugar-coated, but something about the way she said "at your age" scraped against me. I set the teapot down gently. "Experience teaches you a few tricks," I said. She reached across the table and patted my hand. "You're truly an inspiration. I hope when I'm your age I'll still be this independent." The flattery landed like perfume, pleasant but too strong. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Actually, I was wondering, would you like me to help you set up automatic payments for your bills? It might save you some time." I stirred my tea slowly. "I appreciate the offer, but I've been doing just fine for years." Amber smiled wider. "Oh, I know. I just thought since you have so much else to think about, it might be easier to let me handle the small stuff. You could relax more." Relaxation. The word had started to sound like surrender. "I like handling my own affairs," I said evenly. "It keeps me sharp." She nodded, lips pressed into a pout of understanding. "Of course. I just don't want you to feel overwhelmed." We sat in silence for a moment, sipping tea. Outside, the wind rustled the magnolia leaves. Amber broke the quiet first. "You know, I've always wanted us to be close. You're like the mother I never had. My mom was, well, difficult." Her eyes shimmered with practiced emotion. "When David and I got married, I prayed you'd accept me. You have no idea how much that means to me." Something in me softened even though I tried to resist it. I'd always been vulnerable to the sound of someone needing me. "Of course I accept you, Amber," I said gently. "You're part of the family now." Her smile brightened. "Then let me help take care of you." "I take care of myself just fine," I said. Her lashes fluttered. "You don't have to." Later that afternoon, David arrived to pick her up. I'd made roast chicken as I always did when he visited. Watching him hug her before greeting me made my heart ache with nostalgia for the days when I was his only home. During dinner, I mentioned, gently, "David, I'd like to go over some of the expenses on my card this month. There seem to be a few I don't recognize." Amber spoke before he could answer. "Oh, those were the groceries. Remember I told you about them?" "I remember some," I said, "but not the $400 from Luxe Boutique." Amber laughed lightly, waving her hand. "Oh, that's where I bought David a jacket for his new project meeting. You always said presentation matters." I looked at my son. He was too busy cutting his meat to meet my eyes. "Mom," he said after a pause, "Amber just wants us to look our best when we're out networking. It's all for the future." "The future," I repeated. "That's what I thought I was saving for." Amber leaned forward, tone softening. "You've done enough saving. Now it's time to enjoy your money with people who love you." That night after they left, I sat alone in the armchair, the silence pressing against my chest. I thought about her hands, delicate but firm, moving easily through my house like she owned it. Over the next few weeks, the pattern continued. Amber would drop by just to check on me, bringing flowers or baked goods, slipping small requests into the conversation. "Could you pay the internet bill this month? David's bonus was delayed." Or, "My mom's birthday is next week. I want to get her something special, she's been sick." I'll pay you back next Friday. Friday never came. I started keeping track of every dollar, not out of pettiness but survival. One afternoon, as I was balancing my checkbook, Amber appeared in the doorway. You're still doing that by hand? I could help you move all this online. It'd be safer. Safer for who? I asked. She blinked. For you, of course. You don't want to lose track of things. I haven't yet. Her tone shifted slightly. You know, sometimes older people get confused about these things. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Older people, I echoed. I see. I didn't mean you, Mrs. Green. You're sharp as ever. She smiled, too quick, too polished. I'm just trying to help. Help, I said quietly, isn't something you take. It's something you offer. Amber tilted her head. Are you upset with me? I'm disappointed, I said. There's a difference. She fell silent for a long time, then laughed softly. You remind me so much of my grandmother. She never trusted anyone either. That evening I wrote in my notebook, they use kindness as a key. The following week Amber called in the middle of dinner. Hi Mom, she said sweetly. Could I borrow your card tonight? I just need to grab a few things. Promise I'll bring it back first thing in the morning. I looked at the phone, at her smiling face in the picture that flashed with her call. For the first time I didn't answer. The next day she showed up at my door pretending not to notice the tension in the air. You must have been busy last night. I called but no answer. I know, I said. She blinked, waiting for an explanation. I gave her none. Instead I smiled a calm, cold smile and said, would you like some tea? Her eyes searched, mine confused. Sure. We sat at the table, steam rising between us. She talked about nothing, the weather, a sale at the mall, but I barely listened. I was studying her. Every gesture, every calculated pause, every attempt to weave me back into her web. When she finally stood to leave, she hugged me. I'll call you later, okay? I didn't answer. After the door closed, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. I opened my notebook and wrote the words carefully, slowly. Some people use love to bind you. Others use it to blind you. I'm done being blind. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, a storm rolling toward Savannah. I stood by the window watching the dark clouds gather, my reflection faint in the glass. I whispered to myself, let it rain. Because deep down I knew storms don't destroy gardens. They wash them clean. The storm broke that night. Rain drummed on the roof like impatient fingers, the kind that wouldn't let you rest until morning. I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling fan, spinning shadows across the walls. Somewhere between the thunderclaps, a decision took shape. By dawn, the sky cleared, leaving the air heavy and wet. I went downstairs, made a pot of coffee, and opened my laptop. The numbers on my bank statement glared at me like open wounds, thousands drained away by hands that once held mine. January, 6 cent dollars on restaurant expense. February, 9 cent dollars in home decor. March, a $1 dollar charge at Tech World Electronics. My breathing slowed. I printed every statement, stacking them neatly on the dining table until they formed a small tower of betrayal. For 2 years I'd ignored the math, telling myself family meant trust. But trust without limits was a hole you could drown in. By noon I was standing in line at the bank, folder in hand. The teller greeted me with a polite smile, the kind you wear for everyone. Good afternoon, Mrs. Green. How can we help you today? I need to change the password on my debit card, I said. Immediately. Lost or compromised? Compromised, I answered. By someone I love. The teller's smile faltered just a bit, but she nodded. We'll issue a new code and freeze online transfers until the update is complete. Good, I said. And I'd like to set up a verification alert for every transaction over $50. Of course, ma'am. We can do that. When I left the bank, a gust of warm air hit my face. The world looked different, cleaner, somehow sharper. I held my new card like a badge of ownership. It wasn't just plastic. It was permission to stop being afraid. Back home, I brewed fresh coffee and spread the papers across the table. I highlighted the worst of the transactions in bright yellow. Restaurants, spas, clothing, boutiques, luxury shops, every indulgence carved out of my savings. The numbers didn't just tell a story of greed. They told a pattern of control. The doorbell rang mid-afternoon. I didn't need to look to know who it was. I opened the door slowly, and there stood Amber, her hair perfectly styled despite the humidity. "Hi, Mom," she said with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside wordlessly. She walked in like she owned the place, scanning the room as if to ensure nothing had changed. Her gaze landed on the papers on the dining table. "What's all this?" she asked, voice light. "Proof," I said. She blinked. "Proof of what?" "Of every dollar that left my account without my consent." Amber laughed nervously. "You must be mistaken. Every time I used your card I told you I cut her off. You told me stories, Amber. You told me you needed medicine, then bought handbags. You said you were paying a bill, then took David to dinner. You didn't ask for help. You took advantage." Her smile tightened. "You're making this sound so ugly. We're family. Family doesn't steal." She let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "Oh, come on, Loretta. You're overreacting. It's not like we took your entire fortune." "You took my peace," I said quietly. "And that's worth more than money." Her tone shifted, subtle but sharp. "Are you accusing me of theft?" "I'm stating facts. The bank confirmed unauthorized charges. From your usual stores." Amber's voice cracked, with practiced disbelief. "You think I'm lying. You think I'm a criminal. I think you're entitled," I said. "And I think it ends today." She folded her arms, eyes narrowing. "You've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe it's making you forgetful. David's worried, you know. He says you've been confused about finances." I felt my jaw tighten. "I'm not confused. I'm just done pretending not to see." Amber sighed, tilting her head. "You know, sometimes when people get older, they start imagining things. It's nothing to be ashamed of." Her tone was sugar, but her words were poison. I straightened my shoulders. "If I ever start imagining things, I'll let my doctor tell me. Not my daughter-in-law." The mask slipped then. Her eyes hardened. "You're making a huge mistake. David won't like this." "I'm not raising David anymore," I said. "He can like whatever he wants." Amber stared at me, and for the first time I saw the real woman beneath the polish, a creature of calculation and coldness. "You think changing a password fixes this?" she hissed. "You'll see how complicated you've made things." "I already have," I said, nodding toward the door. "You should go now." She didn't move. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "We've been patient with you, Loretta. But if you keep acting paranoid, you'll force us to do something we don't want to." The word paranoid landed like a slap. I smiled thinly. "You should leave before I start recording this conversation." Her jaw clenched. Without another word, she turned on her heel and left the scent of her expensive perfume lingering like smoke. When the door clicked shut, I locked it and leaned against the frame, breathing deeply. My hands shook not from fear but from adrenaline. I wasn't used to confrontation anymore. But the trembling wasn't weakness, it was release. As evening fell, I sat at my desk, writing everything down in my notebook, the dates, the words, the tone of her voice. Documentation. Evidence. The phone rang once. Twice. I didn't answer. Then the answering machine picked up. David's voice sharp and disappointed. "Mom, what did you do?" "Amber said you accused her of stealing." "This is ridiculous. Call me back before you make things worse." I stared at the blinking red light until it stopped flashing. Outside, the sun dipped behind the oaks, their long shadows stretching across the yard like fingers reaching for something that wasn't theirs. I rose, drew the curtains, and whispered to the empty room, "You've both taken enough." For dinner, I made something simple, soup and bread, and ate in silence. The house creaked as it settled, every sound amplified by solitude. But for once, the silence didn't scare me. It reminded me I was alone because I had chosen to be. Before bed, I walked to the study. The safe behind the painting waited silent and unbothered. I placed my new card inside along with the old one now cut clean in half. I closed the door and turned the lock. Then I whispered the new password under my breath, committing it to memory. Mine. Upstairs, I turned off the lights. The house fell into darkness, but for the first time in years, I slept without dreams. The following morning smelled of wet earth and coffee. I woke up earlier than usual, the kind of early that comes after a night of calm resolve. The storm outside had passed, but another one was waiting in my inbox. When I opened my email, there were 6 new messages. 2 from the bank confirming the password change. 3 from David. 1 from Amber. The first line of David's message read, "We need to talk, this has gone too far." The last one said, "Call me Mom. You're making things worse." I deleted them all without reading further. At 9, I stood on the porch watering the begonias. The air was thick and humid, but it didn't bother me. I watched the droplets cling to the petals and slide off tiny pearls of light. My garden never asked for more than I could give. People did. Around noon, the quiet broke again. A car door slammed, footsteps echoed on the front walk, and then came the familiar pounding. "Mom, open up, David." I placed the watering can down, wiped my hands on my apron, and opened the door. He looked the same as always, neatly dressed, handsome in that clean-cut way that once made me proud, but his eyes were wild. "What were you thinking?" he said, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. "Amber couldn't pay at the store yesterday. She was humiliated. I was humiliated years before she was," I said quietly, closing the door behind him. "She'll survive." "Mom, stop it." His voice cracked, raw and furious. "You've changed the password on the account, and now we can't access anything. What are you hiding?" "I'm not hiding anything. I'm protecting what's left." David raked his fingers through his hair. "You're being paranoid. Amber told me you accused her of stealing." "How could you even think that?" "Because she did," I said. He froze. "That's a serious accusation." "So is fraud." For a moment, silence stretched between us like a tightrope. I saw his jaw twitch, the muscle working beneath the skin. He took a step closer. "You've never talked to me like this before." "Maybe that's the problem." His eyes flashed. "Mom, we're family. You can't just cut us off like we're strangers. Strangers don't usually drain my bank account." His mouth opened, then shut again. "You're imagining things." I walked to the table and handed him the folder I'd prepared, the same one I'd shown Amber. "Here's the evidence. Every charge, every receipt. I didn't imagine any of it." He stared down at the papers, but didn't touch them. "Amber said these were all discussed with you." "They weren't. She wouldn't lie to me." "She already has." His breathing quickened. "You're making her out to be some kind of villain." "She's my wife." "And I'm your mother," I said, my voice calm but sharp as glass. "I'm the one who raised you after your father died. I taught you right from wrong. Or at least I tried." He turned away, running both hands over his face. "You're losing it, Mom. You're confused, you're tired, and now you're accusing us of theft because you don't understand your own finances." That word again, confused. It sliced clean through me. "David," I said, slowly, "you think I don't notice how your tone changes when you talk to me now, how you sound like you're explaining something to a child." He spun around. "Because you're acting like one. You changed the card password without telling us. You blocked transfers." "Amber's been in tears all day. She'll recover," I said. "She said you screamed at her." I told her the truth. David's fists clenched. "You're treating her like a criminal. She forged my signature." That stopped him cold. "What?" I pointed to one of the highlighted statements. "March. Jewelry store. She signed my name on the receipt. I have a copy." He laughed, once the sound brittle. "You can't prove that." "I can, and I will. The bank already has it." The color drained from his face. For a second I saw fear, real fear, before pride replaced it. "You didn't have to do that. You could have come to me." "I did," I said. "You didn't listen." He stared at the floor, jaw tight. "You think this fixes anything? You've just embarrassed us in front of everyone." Amber was crying at the bank today. The people at the bank know what fraud looks like. I'm sure they've seen worse. He exhaled sharply, then slammed his hands on the table. "You're destroying this family." "No," I said. "I'm refusing to let it destroy me." The words hung in the air. David straightened, his eyes cold now. "If you're going to treat us like enemies, then fine. But don't expect us to be here when you realize how alone you are." "Alone isn't the same as abandoned," I said softly. "Sometimes it's peace." He shook his head. "You'll regret this." When you're old and sick, when no one's around to take care of you, you'll wish you hadn't pushed us away. I'm already old, I said. And I've taken care of myself my entire life. That won't change. He grabbed his coat, muttering, "Unbelievable." At the door, he paused, glancing back. "Amber's hurt, Mom. You should apologize before this goes too far." I met his gaze evenly. "It already has." He left without another word. When the door clicked shut, I locked it. The silence that followed was so deep I could hear my own heartbeat. My hands were trembling again, but this time it wasn't fear, it was grief. I sat down and looked around the living room, the same room where I'd celebrated David's birthdays, taught him to dance by standing on my feet, told him bedtime stories about kindness. I whispered to the empty room, "I didn't raise you for this." Outside, thunder rumbled again, distant but heavy. I went to the window, pulling the curtains back just enough to see his car drive away. He didn't look back. Hours passed. The light faded. I made myself dinner but barely touched it. At 9, the phone rang again. Amber's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring. The machine picked up. Her voice poured out, dripping with mock concern. "Loretta, I know you're there. We just want to talk. You're making David so upset. Please don't do anything rash. You're acting unstable. People are starting to worry." Click. Unstable. Another word meant to make me doubt my own mind. I looked at the phone for a long moment, before turning it off completely. Later, as I washed my hands in the kitchen sink, my reflection stared back from the dark window, older, yes, but steady. The kind of face that had weathered too many storms to collapse over one more. I dried my hands, turned off the lights, and whispered to the darkness, "Let them worry." Because for the first time in years, I wasn't the one afraid. 3 days passed without a single call. The silence was heavier than the rain-soaked air outside, thick enough to feel like its own presence. I didn't miss the sound of their voices, but I couldn't ignore the ache that came with quiet. It was the ache of knowing your own child was plotting against you. On the 4th day, the quiet broke. I was peeling potatoes when the front door burst open so hard the hinges groaned. "Mom!" David's voice filled the hallway. "Where are you?" I froze the knife halfway through a potato. His footsteps stormed closer, shaking the old wooden floor. When he appeared in the doorway, I barely recognized him. His shirt was untucked, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep or rage or both. "What's wrong with you?" he demanded. "Amber just called me from the grocery store crying because your card declined again, she couldn't pay." "Do you enjoy humiliating her in public?" I set down the knife and wiped my hands slowly. "David, you don't live here anymore. You can't just barge in." He ignored that, taking another step toward me. "You're going to fix this right now. Give me the new password." "No," I said calmly. His nostrils flared. "Excuse me," I said. "No. The card is mine. The money is mine." "Mom, we're family. You can't act like this. You keep saying that word," I said. "Family." "But family doesn't use my trust like an ATM." He slammed his fist against the counter. "Don't talk to me like that, then stop acting like a stranger." For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. His chest rose and fell like a drumbeat, every breath loud and ragged. "Amber said, 'You've lost it,'" he spat. "She said you accused her of stealing. Of lying. She's terrified you're going senile." I laughed, soft, bitter, and sharp as glass. "Is that the story she's telling now? She's worried about you. She's worried about the money," I said. "And if you can't see that, you're blinder than I thought." His voice rose. "You're selfish. You've spent your whole life pretending to be generous. But the moment we need help, you turn into a miser." That word again. Miser. It sliced through me like a familiar knife. I looked him straight in the eyes. "You think I owe you, because I'm your mother. But love doesn't come with a debit line, David. God, listen to yourself." He started pacing his hands, pulling at his hair. "This isn't you. You're letting paranoia ruin everything." "Paranoia doesn't print bank statements," I said. "Facts do." He stopped, breathing hard. "We needed that card for necessities," I raised an eyebrow. "Like dinner at the Ritz, or the $1,200 electronics purchase you never mentioned." His mouth opened, but no words came out. "Yeah," I said quietly. The bank called about that one. Amber needed that for work, he shouted. She doesn't have a job that requires a laptop worth $1,200. He ran both hands over his face, groaning. You don't get it, do you? Everything we're doing is for us, for our future. Why can't you support that? Because your future doesn't need to be built on my past, I said. I worked 40 years to have something of my own. I'm not funding your lifestyle because you can't say no to a woman with expensive taste. He took a step closer, voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. You're making a huge mistake, Mom. I didn't move. No, David. I'm correcting one. His face twisted in anger. If you keep this up, you're going to regret it. Threats don't suit you, I said softly. He slammed the counter again. It's not a threat, it's a promise. You're going to push us too far. Then maybe you should ask yourself why there's a line to push in the first place. He stood there trembling, then turned toward the door. You think you can control everything, but you can't. You're going to end up alone and broke. I've been alone before, I said, and I was fine. Broke, that only happens when you let people like you keep taking. He stared at me, his expression unreadable, then turned the knob and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the window rattled. I stood there, the silence collapsing around me. My pulse thudded in my ears, but I didn't shake. I felt strangely steady, like a tree that's weathered enough storms to know it won't fall. I walked to the window and watched his car speed away. The sound of tires screeching down the street echoed in my chest like a final goodbye. Minutes later, the phone rang. I didn't answer. The machine clicked, and Amber's voice filled the air, sharp and venomous this time. I hope you're proud of yourself, she said. David's devastated. You've ruined this family, Loretta. You need help. Everyone can see it, but you. Click. I unplugged the phone. The afternoon passed in uneasy quiet. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps, every gust of wind like a whisper of judgment. I made myself tea but didn't drink it. My hands itched to do something, anything to make the noise inside me stop. Finally, I went to the study. The safe was still locked, hidden behind the framed landscape of the Savannah marshlands. I opened it and took out the folder with all my statements, my documentation, and something else I hadn't touched in years, Robert's old will. His handwriting filled the last page, steady and clean. Everything shall go to my wife Loretta Green, in full trust that she will manage our assets responsibly. For a long time I just stared at that line, in full trust. I took a pen from the drawer and wrote one small note at the bottom. Amendment forthcoming. The words didn't tremble. Neither did I. That night, while the crickets sang and the cicadas hummed in the dark, I sat at the dining table drafting a new version of my own will. This one didn't include David or Amber. Instead, it named a community charity that provided housing for single mothers. It felt poetic in a way. The help I had never stopped offering would finally go to someone who wouldn't weaponize it. When I was finished, I signed my name and slipped the document into the folder labeled Estate. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the suffocating quiet from before. This silence felt earned, like a reprieve after years of noise. I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs. Before reaching the top, I paused, glancing back toward the front door. The memory of David's face lingered in my mind, his fury, his disbelief. I knew this wasn't the end. People who live off others don't walk away quietly. But I also knew something he didn't. I wasn't the same woman he'd shouted at weeks ago. The version of me who once bent out of love had learned to stand straight again. I went to bed and closed my eyes, my final thought as clear as a bell: let them come. I'm ready. The house was still when I woke up, that deep kind of silence that hums after a storm. Morning light spilled across the kitchen floor in soft gold rectangles. I stood there for a while, staring at the patterns on the tiles, feeling the strange calm that always follows chaos. But underneath that calm was a pulse, steady, deliberate. I knew what I had to do next. After breakfast, I walked to my study and pulled out the folder marked Estate. The papers I'd signed the night before sat inside alongside bank statements, receipts, and printouts. I laid everything on the dining table, one piece at a time, like assembling a puzzle whose picture I already knew. Then I went back to the cabinet where I kept old documents, tax forms, insurance policies, Robert's death certificate, and noticed something odd. One of the folders looked thinner than it should have been. My chest tightened. I pulled it out. Inside were copies of my medical papers, the deed to the house, and tucked between them a single white envelope I didn't recognize. My name was written on the front, in handwriting that wasn't mine. I opened it. Inside was a crisp photocopy front and back of my credit card. Every number visible, even the 3-digit code. And there in the corner of the page, a note written in neat cursive, "For emergencies, A." Amber's handwriting. The air left my lungs. For a long moment I couldn't move. My heart thudded in my ears, the room spinning slightly as I stared at that small, treacherous A. I sat down, gripping the edge of the table. My fingers trembled not from weakness but from fury. All this time I had told myself I might be overreacting, that maybe I was misreading their intentions. But this was proof carved in ink and paper. Amber had copied my card. She had stood in this very room pretending to help me, pretending to be family, while stealing my information right under my nose. I remembered the afternoon she'd offered to help organize my bills. How she'd smiled sweetly as she held my purse. How she'd touched my shoulder and said, "You can trust me." She hadn't just borrowed my card, she'd scanned it, memorized it, turned it into her personal key. I felt something deep inside me harden, like a lock snapping shut. I picked up the phone and called the bank. "Savannah First Financial, how can I help you today?" a bright female voice answered. "This is Loretta Green," I said, my voice even. "I need to report unauthorized use of my account." The woman's tone softened instantly. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Green. Can you confirm some recent transactions?" She listed them one by one. The restaurant in March. The electronics store. The cash withdrawals at 3 a.m. "No," I said to each. "No. No. I see. We'll flag those and open an investigation. Would you like us to send you a full report of your account activity for the past 12 months? "Yes," I said. "Send everything." When I hung up, I sat in silence for a while. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up: lawnmowers, dogs, the faint rumble of delivery trucks. The world moved on, ordinary and indifferent. I looked at the photocopy again. The paper was smooth beneath my fingertips, almost innocent. But I knew what it meant. Amber had turned my trust into evidence of my own foolishness. I took out my phone and scrolled through old photos. There she was, smiling beside David, at last year's Christmas dinner, one hand on his shoulder, the other resting lightly on my arm. I zoomed in. Her nails painted pale pink, just like now. Her smile, perfect. My stomach twisted. The worst part wasn't the theft. It was the intimacy of it. The betrayal came from someone who had sat across my table, eaten my food, hugged me goodnight. I rose and opened the front door. The morning sun was bright and hot already. My garden shimmered with dew, the begonias finally standing upright again after days of neglect. I whispered to them, "We're going to fix this." Back inside, I made myself a cup of tea, needing the ritual of calm. My hands steadied as I poured the water, as if my body understood what my mind hadn't yet said out loud. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control: who had it, who lost it, and who would never give it up again. When the phone rang an hour later, I already knew who it was. Amber's name flashed on the screen. I let it ring once, twice before picking up. "Loretta," her voice came cheerful, false practiced. "I was just calling to see how you're doing. You've been so quiet lately." "I'm fine," I said. "Good. Oh, by the way, I wanted to buy something online for David's work anniversary, but I forgot your card's security code. Do you remember it?" The audacity almost made me laugh. "No," I said, slowly. "I don't." She hesitated. "You don't remember it, I don't share it." Silence. Then a nervous chuckle. "Oh, of course, I just thought since we use it together." "We don't," I interrupted, "and from now on, no one will." There was a pause long enough to stretch into threat. "Are you angry about something, Loretta?" she asked sweetly. "I'm disappointed," I said again. "There's a difference." Her tone dropped. "I think we should talk in person." "I don't think we should." "I'll come by," she said, quickly ignoring me. "We can clear this up, don't," I warned, but the line had already gone dead. 20 minutes later, her silver car appeared in my driveway. She rang the bell twice, then smiled when I opened the door. "See, talking face to face always helps." She stepped inside without invitation, glancing around like she was checking inventory. Then she sat on the couch, crossed her legs, and took the credit card out of her purse. She placed it on the table between us. "Here it is," she said, smiling faintly. "But before I give it back, we should really talk." I didn't sit. "About what?" "About why you suddenly don't trust us," she said, standing and walking slowly around the living room, her hand grazing the picture frames on the wall. "About why you're acting like we're strangers." "Because I found a copy of my card in my files," I said. "Your handwriting was on it." Her face didn't even twitch. "Oh, that old thing I made that months ago. Just in case you ever needed me to help pay a bill for you. It was for emergencies. You made a copy of my card without telling me," I said evenly. "That's not help, that's theft." Her smile faded. "You really shouldn't use words like that. People might start thinking you're paranoid." "That's what people say when they're caught," I said. Amber's voice turned soft, almost pitying. "You're alone in this house all day, Loretta. Sometimes loneliness does strange things to the mind." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "You don't get to gaslight me in my own living room." Her eyes flickered. "You sound upset." "I am," I said, "but not in the way you think." She looked at me for a long moment, then picked up the card and handed it to me. "Fine," she said. "If this makes you feel better, take it. But I hope you understand you've made things much harder for everyone." I took it from her hand and slipped it into my pocket. "That's my intention." She moved toward the door, pausing before leaving. "You know it's sad. I thought of you like a mother." "I already have a child," I said, "and I raised him better than this." She gave a small, cold laugh. "You'll regret pushing us away." I opened the door wider. "Goodbye, Amber." She left without another word. When the engine of her car faded down the street, I closed the door, locked it, and pressed my back against the wood. The house was silent again, but it didn't feel empty this time. It felt safe. I walked to the kitchen, placed the card in a drawer, and wrote one line on a sticky note I stuck above my desk: "Proof. Protect it." Outside, the sun shifted, breaking through the clouds. The light fell across the garden in long, golden stripes. I watched it for a moment, then whispered to the quiet air, "You wanted a fight, Amber. Now you've got one." The next morning dawned brighter than it had in weeks. The air carried that sharp clarity that always follows a storm, the kind of light that makes every edge seem cleaner, every sound sharper. I got dressed with deliberate calm, buttoning my linen blouse, tying my scarf neatly under my chin. My reflection in the mirror looked older, yes, but certain. I had lived 70 years on this earth, and I finally knew what fear I was done bowing to. At 9 o'clock, I drove downtown to the bank. The clerk behind the counter smiled when she saw me approach. "Good morning, Mrs. Green. How are you today? Ready to set a few things right?" I said. I handed her the folder I'd spent all night organizing. "I'd like to report fraudulent activity on my account." Her expression changed from polite to professional. "I see. Do you have documentation?" "I do. 2 years' worth." She led me to a small private office. I sat across from her as she examined each page, occasionally frowning, occasionally shaking her head. When she looked up again, her tone was careful, sympathetic. "You've definitely been a victim of elder financial abuse, Mrs. Green. We'll open a formal investigation today." The phrase elder financial abuse sounded strange in the air, but it fit like a lock clicking into place. "I'd also like to set up alerts for all transactions over $25, I said. "And I want any future withdrawals to require my physical signature." "Absolutely," she said. "Would you like us to recommend an attorney who handles these cases?" "Yes," I said. "I think it's time." She handed me a business card. Curtis Miller and Associates. They specialize in protecting senior assets. When I stepped back into the sunlight, I felt taller somehow, like the ground beneath me had decided to hold steady again. Curtis Miller's office was in an old brick building 2 blocks from the courthouse. The brass plaque beside the door read Senior Rights and Estate Protection. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. The receptionist, a cheerful woman with gray curls, ushered me into a sunlit room lined with bookshelves. Curtis stood as I entered, a man in his early 60s, tall, broad-shouldered skin, the color of walnut eyes, kind but observant. His suit was well worn but pressed with care. "Mrs. Green," he said, extending his hand. "Please have a seat. I've heard you've had a rough few months." "I've had worse," I said, sitting down, "but this one comes close." He smiled slightly, the kind of smile that tells you he's seen too many people arrive in that same chair carrying the same weight. "Why don't you start from the beginning?" So I did. I told him everything from the first loan I'd given David and Amber, to the emergency purchases, to the copy of my card I'd found in my files. My voice stayed steady until I reached the part where my own son had called me paranoid. That word still burned. Curtis didn't interrupt. He took notes on a yellow legal pad, his pen moving in quiet rhythm. When I finished, the silence stretched for a moment. Then he said, "You're not paranoid, Mrs. Green. You're being gaslighted. That's what abusers do, they make you question your own memory." Something inside me cracked, something I hadn't realized was holding on. I looked down at my folded hands and let out a breath I'd been holding for months. "That's exactly what it felt like." He nodded. "You've done the right thing. You kept your records, you changed your passwords, you documented everything. You've taken the first steps most people never do. Will it be enough?" "It will be the beginning," he said. "Now we'll do the rest." He explained what would happen next. Formal reports to the bank, the police, and the Senior Financial Protection Bureau. "We'll establish a timeline of misuse," he said, flipping through my documents. "And we'll prepare to counter any retaliation. Abusers don't like losing control." "Retaliation?" I asked. "It's common," he said simply. "They might spread rumors, file false claims, even threaten guardianship if they think you're unfit. But that's why you'll have me." I smiled faintly. "A lawyer and a bodyguard. Something like that," he said. His voice softened. "You remind me of my mother. She went through something similar after my father died. A nephew convinced her to sign over part of her property. Took years to fix it. It's why I do this now." That admission settled in me like warmth spreading through cold water. "I'm sorry that happened to her," I said. "She'd be proud of what you're doing," he replied. He went through my evidence, meticulously marking certain pages with sticky notes. "This photocopy of your card, this is solid proof. Handwriting can be traced. If she tries to deny it, we'll match the sample." "Amber always said she had steady hands," I murmured. "Maybe that'll help." Curtis chuckled softly, the sound low and reassuring. "We'll make sure the truth holds steady too." He gathered everything into a neat pile. "I'll file these today. In the meantime, I want you to document any calls or visits from them. Don't respond, just record times and details. And if they show up again, call me before you open that door." I nodded. "Understood." "Good." Now he reached across the desk, his eyes kind but firm. "You've spent a lifetime taking care of others, Mrs. Green. It's time you let someone take care of you." I hesitated, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "I'm not used to that." "I figured," he said with a smile. "But you'll get the hang of it." When I left his office, the afternoon sun had turned the bricks of the courthouse a deep red. People passed by on the sidewalk, some in suits, some in uniforms, some with grocery bags and babies on their hips. Life went on as it always did. But for once I felt part of it again, not hidden behind drawn curtains and whispered accusations. Back home I brewed tea and sat on the porch. The cicadas were loud, their rhythm steady as a heartbeat. I opened my notebook and wrote at the top of a fresh page. Step 1, report. Step 2, lawyer. Step 3, breathe. The phone rang once that evening, but I didn't answer. It was David's number. I let the machine take it. His voice came through quieter than before, but still cold. "Mom, I don't know what you're doing, but you're making this worse. Call me back before you ruin everything." I didn't. Instead, I went out to the garden, the sky painted in streaks of orange and violet. The flowers swayed gently, their petals glowing in the last light of day. I knelt beside the begonias, touching one of the leaves between my fingers. "You and me both," I whispered. "We're growing again." When I went inside, I turned off the lights, leaving the house dim and peaceful. I sat at my desk one last time, staring at Curtis's business card under the lamplight. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a victim waiting to be rescued. I felt like a woman preparing to win. The envelope came on a Tuesday morning. No return address, just my name typed neatly on the front. I found it wedged between the gas bill and a grocery flyer, and for a moment, I almost tossed it aside. But something about its weight made me stop. I tore it open right there by the kitchen counter, and my knees nearly gave out. It wasn't a letter. It was a summons. Petition for guardianship, the heading read. Beneath it, filed by David Green. The words blurred for a second, then sharpened again, cruel and clear. My own son had gone to court claiming I was no longer capable of managing my finances. The reason listed: paranoia, confusion, and erratic decision-making. I sank into the nearest chair. My hands trembled, but not from weakness. Rage vibrated through my bones. After all I had done. After the sleepless nights, the loans, the patience. Now he wanted to take what was left of my life and sign his name over it. The clock ticked loudly on the wall, each second striking harder than the one before. I reached for the phone and called Curtis. He picked up on the second ring. "Mrs. Green, he's filed for guardianship," I said. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. "My son wants legal control of my finances." There was a pause, then his tone steadied. "I'll be right there." He arrived within the hour, coat slung over his arm, his expression unreadable. He skimmed the document, his jaw tightening slightly. "This is a classic retaliation move," he said. "They're trying to flip the narrative to make you look unstable so you can't fight back." "He's my son, Curtis," I whispered. "He wants to put me on paper as incompetent." Curtis met my eyes. "You're not incompetent. You're being manipulated. And this," he tapped the paper, "is exactly what financial abusers do when they start losing control." I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. I just felt hollow. "What do we do now?" "We fight," he said simply. "But we do it the smart way." He outlined the steps. We'd file a countermotion, gather medical records proving my mental clarity, and build evidence of the financial abuse. He spoke with calm precision, the kind of certainty that fills a room like light. By the time he left, the trembling in my hands had stopped. But when night came, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing David's voice in my head, every cruel word, every accusation. And beneath them, the ghost of his childhood laughter. By the next morning, the rumors had begun. Mrs. Dalton, my neighbor from across the street, came by carrying a casserole. Her smile was too polite. "Loretta dear, I heard you've been having some trouble. People are saying you've been under a lot of stress." I forced a smile. "I'm fine, Ruth. Don't believe everything you hear." She patted my hand awkwardly. "Well, David and Amber were just so concerned. They said you've been confused lately, forgetting things." The words hit like a slap. "Did they?" I said quietly. She nodded. "They just want what's best for you." When she left, I stood in the doorway, watching her walk down the path, the casserole still warm in my hands. I wanted to throw it into the trash, but instead I placed it carefully on the counter. My mother had taught me never to waste food, even when it came wrapped in pity. That evening I called Curtis again. "They're spreading stories," I said. "To the neighbors, probably to my church too." "I expected as much," he replied. "Document everything. Dates, who says what, even overheard conversations. We'll use it later." 2 days later, I sat in the waiting room of Dr. Rodriguez's office, the same doctor who'd treated me for years. When he called my name, his smile was kind and steady. "Loretta," he said, shaking my hand. Curtis filled me in. "Let's get you that cognitive evaluation." He ran me through the tests, dates, memory, recall, simple calculations. I answered each question without hesitation. When it was over, he closed his folder. "You're sharper than most people 20 years younger. I'll write the report today." "Thank you," I said, my throat thick. He looked at me for a long moment. "You raised a good man once." I don't know what happened to him. Neither do I said softly. When I got home, a car was parked outside my gate, David's. My heart dropped. He was leaning against it, phone in hand. As soon as he saw me, he straightened. Mom, we need to talk, he said. I stayed on the path. I think we've talked enough. Please, he said, stepping closer. This has gone too far. You've made things legal now. We can still stop this. I didn't make it legal, I said. You did. His jaw tightened. Amber and I didn't want to do this, but you left us no choice. You're not thinking clearly. You've turned everyone against us. I haven't said a word about you, I said. But maybe people can see what you really are. He flinched. You don't mean that. I mean every word. He exhaled sharply, then lowered his voice. If you don't withdraw your claim, we'll move forward. A judge will declare you unfit. You'll lose access to everything. You'll have to live under supervision. Is that what you want? I looked him straight in the eye. No, David. What I want is my son back, but that boy is gone and the man standing in front of me is just a stranger who wants my money. His face twisted. You're impossible. Amber was right. You've gone insane. I didn't raise my voice. If standing up for myself makes me insane, then maybe I should have lost my mind sooner. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned abruptly and walked away. The car roared down the street, leaving the air heavy with exhaust and betrayal. Inside, the house felt smaller. Every photo on the wall seemed to watch me. I sat down on the couch and took a slow breath. I wasn't scared anymore. I was tired, but there was power even in exhaustion when it came from refusing to give in. When Curtis came by the next day, I showed him the doctor's letter and the notes I'd taken about the rumors. He smiled for the first time in days. This is exactly what we needed. They've made their move, and now we'll make ours. We spent the afternoon organizing everything into folders labeled medical bank records, statements, and witnesses. His precision was comforting. Before he left, he rested a hand on my shoulder. They've underestimated you, he said. That's their mistake. After he was gone, I sat on the porch as the sun went down the sky, bleeding pink and gold. The wind carried the smell of magnolia and distant rain. I whispered to myself, You wanted control, David. Now we'll see who keeps it. The stars appeared one by one, faint but steady. I looked up at them and felt something inside me settle. I was no longer the woman who cried over credit card bills or trembled when the phone rang. Tomorrow would bring courtrooms and questions and lawyers with sharp suits and sharper smiles, but tonight I had something they couldn't take: clarity. I turned off the porch light, went inside and locked the door. The sound of the bolt sliding into place was the closest thing to peace I'd heard in years. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and nerves. I stood in the hallway outside courtroom 3, clutching the edge of my blazer to steady my hands. My reflection in the glass doors looked older than I remembered, but not fragile, anchored like the oak trees outside my house that refused to bend even in the hardest wind. Curtis walked beside me, calm as always, a briefcase in his left hand and quiet strength in his right. You ready? He asked. I nodded. I've been ready for 40 years, I said. I just didn't know it. Inside the courtroom was colder than I expected. The wooden benches gleamed under the fluorescent lights. David and Amber sat at the opposite table, their lawyer whispering something to them. Amber wore a pale blue dress and the same look she had worn the first time I met her, sweetness polished to hide calculation. David couldn't meet my eyes. When the judge entered, everyone stood. His robe was dark, his gaze heavier than I imagined. The clerk read the case number aloud, in the matter of David Green versus Loretta Green. The words echoed in my head like a funeral bell. David's lawyer rose first. Your Honor, he began smoothly, this case concerns the well-being of an elderly woman whose recent actions suggest diminished capacity and possible confusion. My client seeks guardianship not for personal gain but out of concern for his mother's safety. My pulse thudded in my ears. Curtis touched my arm lightly under the table. Let him talk, he whispered. We'll have our turn. The lawyer continued painting me as a woman, unraveling under paranoia, forgetting transactions, accusing family members of theft, blocking accounts impulsively. Each word felt like a pin pricking at my skin. When he sat down, Curtis stood. "Your Honor," he said, voice measured and calm, "this case isn't about confusion, it's about control. My client, Mrs. Green, has spent 2 years being systematically manipulated and financially exploited by the very people who claim to be protecting her. Today she stands here not as a victim but as a woman reclaiming her dignity." He turned slightly, meeting my eyes. "We'll show you the truth." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Curtis called me to the stand first. The courtroom felt enormous as I walked to the witness chair. The oath was familiar. I'd said it before when I testified as a nurse in an old malpractice case decades ago. But this time, the stakes were my own name. "Mrs. Green," Curtis began, "how long have you lived in your home on Willow Street?" 40 years, I said. "My husband and I bought it when our son was born." "And how long have you been managing your own finances?" "Since before David could tie his shoes," I said, and a few people in the audience chuckled softly. Curtis smiled faintly. "Tell us when you first noticed irregularities in your accounts." I took a deep breath. "About 2 years ago. Purchases I didn't make. Withdrawals late at night. And the pattern always appeared when my daughter-in-law had my card." He handed me a document. "Is this one of your bank statements?" "Yes." "And who made these purchases?" "Amber did," I said. "Without my permission." David's lawyer stood. "Objection, speculation." Curtis raised the paper. "Your Honor, the next exhibit includes a photocopy of Mrs. Green's card, front and back, with the handwritten note, 'For emergencies, A.' The handwriting belongs to the defendant's wife." The judge gestured. "Overruled. Continue." Curtis nodded toward me. "What happened when you confronted your son and his wife about these charges?" I swallowed hard. "They told me I was paranoid. That I was too old to understand what was happening. My son said maybe someone else should handle my money for me." "And how did that make you feel?" "Like I'd been erased," I said quietly. Like 40 years of hard work and sacrifice had vanished with one sentence. Curtis let the silence sit for a moment before speaking again. "Thank you, Mrs. Green." He turned to the judge. "I have no further questions for now." David's lawyer approached. His voice dripped with practiced politeness. "Mrs. Green, do you often forget small things, appointments, phone calls, misplaced items?" "No," I said. "Never, never," I repeated. He smiled thinly. "You're 70, correct?" "I'm 70, I said. "Not stupid." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge gave a small warning look and the lawyer stepped back, visibly irritated. Curtis called his next witness, Dr. Rodriguez. My doctor adjusted his glasses and testified with quiet certainty. "Mrs. Green's cognitive tests show full mental capacity. No signs of dementia, confusion, or paranoia. She's sharper than most of my younger patients." The opposing lawyer tried to twist his words, but the doctor's calm dismantled every attempt. Next came the evidence. Curtis displayed transaction reports on the projector, thousands spent at boutiques, restaurants, spas, and electronics stores, all traced to Amber's account. Then came the footage. A short clip from a security camera at TechWorld. Amber standing at the register, swiping a card with my name on it, while the timestamp matched an hour when I was at home on the phone with a friend. The judge leaned forward, watching closely. When the clip ended, the room went still. Curtis's voice was firm. "Your Honor, the evidence shows not confusion but exploitation. Not dementia but deception." The judge turned to David and Amber. "Do you wish to respond?" David stood slowly. "I never meant to hurt her," he said, voice breaking slightly. "I just wanted to make sure she was safe. I thought she was being reckless." Curtis stepped forward. "By opening 3 credit accounts in her name without permission," David blinked, startled. "That was Amber's idea." Amber shot him a look that could cut glass. "Don't drag me into this." Their lawyer hissed something under his breath, but it was too late. The tension had already cracked. The judge cleared his throat. "I've heard enough." He shuffled the papers before him, his eyes scanning the last few lines of the report. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. "This court finds no evidence of diminished capacity," he said. "The petition for guardianship is denied." Furthermore, due to the evidence of unauthorized use and identity theft, this court orders the immediate restitution of $25,000 to Mrs. Green and the closure of all fraudulent accounts. A restraining order is granted, preventing further contact for 1 year. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until the sound came out as a quiet sob. Curtis put a steady hand on my shoulder. Amber covered her face with her hands. David just stared at the floor. For a fleeting moment, I wanted to reach out to him, to tell him I still loved the boy he used to be, but that boy had drowned long ago in greed and weakness. When the judge dismissed the case, I stood, feeling every year of my age and yet lighter than I had in decades. Outside, the air was bright and clean, the sky impossibly blue. Curtis walked beside me, briefcase in hand. "You did beautifully," he said. "I told the truth," I said. "That's all I had left." "Sometimes," he said, "that's all you need." We stopped on the courthouse steps. People rushed past the world, continuing as if nothing monumental had just shifted. I turned to look back at the building's sunlight glinting off its windows. "I won," I whispered. Curtis smiled. "You did." As we walked toward his car, I thought of the years I'd spent letting others dictate who I was, how I should act, what I should give. For the first time, the weight was gone. Justice didn't erase the scars, but it gave them meaning. That night, I sat in my garden with a cup of tea. The begonias swayed softly in the breeze, their petals catching the moonlight. I touched one gently and whispered, "We made it." Somewhere inside the house, the clock ticked quietly, not as a reminder of time lost, but as a promise of what remained. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and let the night settle around me calm and certain. For the first time in years, I didn't feel afraid of what tomorrow would bring. Tomorrow belonged to me. 6 months had passed since the hearing, but sometimes I still woke up expecting another knock on the door. The kind that made my stomach twist before my mind even caught up. But those mornings grew fewer with each sunrise, and the air inside my house finally felt like mine again. The court-ordered payments arrived every month like clockwork, transfers from David's account handled by his lawyer, signed and stamped with legal precision. Curtis made sure of that. I never had to see my son or hear his voice again. The silence that used to ache now hummed with peace. I filled my days with small, steady rituals. Coffee at dawn. A walk through the garden while the dew still clung to the leaves. Reading on the porch until the sun dipped low. I started volunteering at the community center downtown, helping older women learn to navigate online banking, teaching them what to look for when someone just wants to help. Every time one of them whispered, "My son's been handling my money too," I saw my own fear reflected back. And every time I told them, "You have every right to say no," I felt stronger. Curtis still called once a week, sometimes to update me on legal matters, sometimes just to check in. Our calls had shifted from business to something softer. He'd ask about my garden, about my health, about the new book I was reading. Once he brought over a box of lemon scones and stayed for coffee. We sat under the porch, awning the rain, whispering against the roof, talking about everything except the case that had tied our lives together. "You ever think about starting fresh somewhere?" he asked one afternoon, gazing out at the drenched begonias. "I did," I admitted. "After the hearing, I thought maybe I'd sell the house. Start new somewhere no one knows my name." But then I realized, leaving would mean giving up the one place that stayed mine through everything. Curtis nodded. "This house saw you fight for your life. It deserves to see you live it too." We shared a quiet smile, the kind that said more than words could manage. Later that week, he invited me to an event, a legal seminar for senior protection advocates. I hesitated at first, but curiosity won. When I arrived, he introduced me to colleagues as the bravest client I've ever represented. It made me blush, but pride followed right behind it. During the seminar, I listened to stories like mine, women who'd lost everything to children, caregivers, siblings. Some hadn't been as lucky. But many were now fighting back, their voices calm but unbreakable. I realized what I'd been part of wasn't just personal, it was larger. A quiet revolution of mothers and grandmothers deciding enough was enough. After the session ended, Curtis and I walked out together into the cool evening air. He offered his arm, old-fashioned and gentlemanly. I took it. Would it be forward, he said, if I asked you to dinner? I smiled. I think we've earned dinner. We went to a small restaurant by the river, one of those old Savannah places with candles flickering in mason jars, and music soft enough to hear each other breathe. The food tasted better than I remembered meals tasting in years. Maybe it wasn't the food, it was the company. Halfway through dessert, Curtis leaned forward, his voice low. You know, Loretta, I used to think people our age were done with new beginnings. But then I met you. I laughed softly. Are you saying I changed your mind? He smiled. Completely. His hand brushed mine across the table, and something quiet and hopeful bloomed inside me. I hadn't expected love, not at 70, not after the war I'd just fought, but life has a strange way of giving back what you thought you'd lost for good. That night, when he walked me to my door, the porch light cast a warm circle around us. He hesitated, then said, Loretta, these months, they've meant a lot to me. They've meant a lot to me too, I said. He smiled. Good night then. But I caught his sleeve before he turned away. Curtis, yes, stay for tea. He did. From that evening on, the quiet of my house changed again. It wasn't the lonely silence of waiting, it was the peaceful kind that comes from shared space. Curtis started spending more time at my home, sometimes working on new cases from my kitchen table while I read nearby. His presence filled the rooms gently, without intruding. We tended the garden together on weekends. He was terrible at pruning, but he made me laugh every time he tried. Once, as he accidentally snapped a stem, he looked up sheepishly and said, I'm better with laws than leaves. That's fine, I said. I've got enough patience for both. In early October, he surprised me with a ring. It wasn't extravagant, just a delicate gold band with a single pearl. It reminded me of you, he said. Strong, simple, and luminous. My hands shook as he slipped it onto my finger. Curtis, are you sure? He smiled, that warm, unhurried smile of his. I've never been surer of anything. We were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the courthouse. No family, no crowd. Just Alma, my neighbor and loyal friend, as my witness, and Curtis's brother standing by his side. The judge who officiated recognized us from my hearing months earlier and smiled knowingly. When he said, "You may now kiss the bride," I laughed through my tears. Curtis's hands were steady as he pulled me close. Afterward, we went back to the house that had weathered every season of my life and toasted with cheap champagne. "To second chances," he said. "To surviving long enough to deserve them," I replied. As the months unfolded, our life together settled into an easy rhythm. Curtis turned the old study into our shared library, lined with his law books and my novels. We filled the walls with plants and light. Every morning we took our coffee to the porch, and every night, we watched the stars rise over the garden. I hadn't realized how much space loneliness had taken up until it was gone. Once, when I asked him if he ever regretted getting involved in my case, he said, "You weren't a case, Loretta. You were a turning point." There were still echoes of the past, of course. Some nights I'd think of David. I'd wonder if he was eating well, if he'd found work, if he ever lay awake feeling the weight of what he'd done. Curtis never spoke badly of him, not once. He just said, "Some lessons take longer to learn than others." A few weeks before Christmas, I received a short letter in an unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single sentence, "Mom, I'm sorry, David." No return address, no phone number. I held the letter for a long time, tracing the curve of his name. I didn't cry. I didn't call. But I placed it in a box with Robert's old watch and the first picture of David as a baby. Not forgiveness, not revenge, just peace. That night, as Curtis and I sat by the fireplace, he noticed the letter resting on the mantel. "From him?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He didn't ask what it said. He just took my hand. The firelight flickered across his face, and I thought about how strange and beautiful life could be. That after losing everything I thought defined me, I'd found someone who loved me for the woman I became afterward. As I leaned my head on his shoulder, the clock chimed softly. The garden outside slept beneath the cold winter air, waiting for spring. And for the first time, I didn't fear what came next. Because I'd learned something no courtroom, no betrayal, no son could take from me. Peace isn't something you're given, it's something you choose. Spring came softly that year. The garden woke in slow-color lavender buds along the fence, the first blush of begonias, sunlight spilling through the magnolia branches like gold. I was 72, and for the first time in decades, the days didn't feel like something to endure. They felt like something to savor. Curtis was already outside when I came down that morning, kneeling in the dirt with his sleeves rolled up, trying once again to convince the bougainvillea to grow along the trellis. His gray hair glinted under the sun. He looked up and smiled when he saw me, that quiet, grounding smile that had become home. "Morning, Mrs. Harris," he said, using the name that still made me laugh. "Morning, Mr. Harris," I replied, handing him a mug of coffee. "You're fighting a losing battle with that vine." "Maybe," he said, standing up. "But you taught me some things are worth fighting for." We spent the next hour working side by side, him trimming me, watering both of us, moving in easy silence. The kind that comes when two people have survived enough storms to recognize peace when it arrives. When the mail truck passed, I went to the box at the end of the drive. There were the usual things: magazines, bills, a flyer for a new grocery store. But there was also an envelope addressed in handwriting I knew instantly. David. I held it for a long moment before opening it. The paper inside was folded neatly, the ink pressed hard enough that it bled through the back. "Mom," it began. "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, but I hope you'll read this. Amber's gone. She left a year ago, took what little money I had left, and moved west. I lost my job after the lawsuit. For a while, I hated you for everything that happened. But lately I've started to see it wasn't you who ruined my life, it was me. You warned me who she was and I didn't listen. I believed the wrong person and I hurt the only one who never stopped believing in me." There was a pause in the lines, a smudge that looked like water had touched it. "I'm working again, nothing fancy. Just bookkeeping for a small firm. I rent a small place outside Macon. It's not much, but it's mine. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope you're happy. You deserve that. If you ever want to talk, you know where to find me. Love, David." The last word, the one I thought I'd never see again, blurred a little as I read it. I folded the letter carefully and stood for a while under the morning light, listening to the birds fussing in the magnolia. When I walked back to the garden, Curtis was rinsing his hands with the hose. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Yes," I said and smiled. "Better than all right?" I didn't tell him what the letter said. Some things were meant to rest quietly in the heart. But that night after dinner, I sat at my desk and wrote a short reply. "Dear David, I'm glad you're finding your way. It's never too late to start again. Be kind to yourself. Love, Mom." No anger. No judgment. Just a door left slightly open. The next morning I mailed it. I didn't wait for an answer. Life went on as it always does. Curtis took on fewer cases, focusing on teaching law students about elder protection. I helped him organize his lectures, and he called me his unofficial research partner. The title made me proud in ways I hadn't expected. On weekends we drove along the coast, windows down, the scent of salt and wild jasmine filling the car. Sometimes we stopped for shrimp po' boys at a roadside cafe. Sometimes we just watched the sunset paint the marshes gold. One evening in late summer, Curtis asked, "Do you ever think about what you'd tell that younger version of yourself, the one who let them take advantage of her?" I thought for a long time. I'd tell her that saying no isn't unkind. It's survival. That giving endlessly doesn't make you generous, it makes you empty. And that someday she'll wake up and realize she doesn't owe anyone her peace. Curtis nodded slowly. "I think she'd be proud of who you became." I smiled. "I think she'd finally recognize herself again." That night we sat on the porch watching the stars rise. The air was thick with summer, the crickets loud and relentless. I leaned against him, my hand resting on his. His pulse beat steady beneath my fingers. "Do you ever wish things had gone differently?" I asked quietly. He squeezed my hand. "No. Because every wrong turn led you here. We didn't speak after that. We didn't need to. The years rolled on softly after that, kind years, quiet years. My garden grew wild and full again. The begonias that once wilted under neglect now thrived under steady care. I started writing small essays about aging boundaries and the strange freedom that comes from losing what you once thought you couldn't live without. People began reading them. Some wrote letters. "Your story helped me stand up to my children," one woman wrote. "Thank you for reminding me that love doesn't mean surrender." Every word reminded me that pain, when faced honestly, could turn into something useful, something that reached beyond the walls of my house. One Sunday, as I finished watering the flowers, Curtis called from the porch. "We've got company." Alma Davis was there, holding a basket of lemons from her tree. Her smile was broad and knowing. "You two look disgustingly happy," she said, laughing. "Guilty," I replied. We sat outside, the three of us, sharing lemonade and stories until the light turned golden and soft. The conversation drifted to the past, to the way the world had changed, to how we'd all learned the hard way that peace was worth protecting. When Alma left, I lingered on the porch a little longer. Curtis wrapped his arm around my shoulders. "You know," he said softly, "one day someone's going to tell your story and think it's just a fable. They won't believe people could be so cruel or so brave." I smiled. "Maybe, but as long as it helps someone keep their dignity, they can call it whatever they want." The wind stirred the vines above us, and the air filled with the scent of rain. I looked out over the garden, the place where I'd once cried, once doubted, once feared, and saw it now for what it had become, a living record of resilience. As the first drops began to fall, Curtis took my hand. We stood there together in the rain, laughing like children unafraid of the storm. That night before bed, I opened my journal and wrote one last line beneath months of scribbles and notes. "It's never too late to reclaim your life, even when the world thinks you've lost it." Then I closed the book and placed it on my nightstand. Outside, the rain fell steady and kind, washing everything clean. If you're hearing my story tonight, wherever you are, remember this saying: no is an act of love for yourself first. And if you've ever been made to feel small for protecting what's yours, take a deep breath and stand tall. You're not alone. Now tell me, where are you listening from? Leave me a comment below and let's talk. If you believe in stories of strength and second chances, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. There are more stories waiting for you on this channel, stories of women and men who stood their ground when no one believed them. I'll see you in the next one.